Hello everyone, in this GraphQL tutorial we're going to be covering working with queries. And so to follow along, you'll want to download the starting code from GitHub. The link is in the description. It's GraphQL Prisma series here. And what you'll want to do is, clone it like normal. And so once you've got that copied, we can come over to our wherever you're wanting to put it and run a git clone. So git clone. Git clone. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and switch into that directory, GraphQL Prisma series, and then we'll want to download or switch to the right branch. And I believe it's start GraphQL queries. So git checkout start GraphQL queries. Okay, and then we'll want to run npm install. And then we'll want to open up our text editor. And then in your terminal, run node src index.js, and we're ready to go. This is one part of a complete GraphQL series where we build an entire production-ready application. Please subscribe to the channel and click the link in the description to get the latest tutorials and the rest of the series. So when you're using GraphQL, we obviously need data to actually get and update and all of that kind of stuff. So whether you're connected to a MongoDB database or Postgres or whatever it is, or it's even hard-coded or in a JSON file, it doesn't really matter. You just have to have some sort of data. And so to start, we're just going to use an array of objects. And so let's go ahead and do that. So I've got this users array here with an ID, first name, and an email. And so these user objects take the shape of, what we would consider a user. And if a user is one of the types that we're going to be working with in our server, then we need to have a type of user. And so we would define the shape of that user inside of our type defs. So what we can do is, or what we need to do, is create a user object. So we've got type user with the ID of the ID and the first name of the string and an email of type string. And so the explanation points are again required, and they look exactly the same. And that's because this is the definition of what this object needs to look like. And so now we have the definition of what a user object looks like. What if we wanted to actually get the users, we could query them. We would have to create a query for getting those users. And so what we would do here is we would call it whatever we want. I'll call it users because that makes sense. And then you can signify that you want a list of users by using these curly brackets or straight brackets. And so then we would put inside of here the user, and we would say that the user is required. And this would give us a list of users. And so we have our definition of the function that we want to do. We want to run a query to get all users, but we don't know how to actually do that yet, or our code doesn't know how to do it. So we have to go down into our resolvers and actually define the function and how it actually gets the users. And because this is a query, we're just retrieving information, we would put this in the query root type. And so we need, just like we have a hello world function for our hello world definition up here, or our type def, we need a users function as well. So we can go ahead and make that here. And again, it looks just like it, but this time we have the arguments. So we've got 4. GraphQL always comes with 4. So we've got parent, args, context, and info. And we don't need any of them yet, so we're just going to return the users array. So we've got users array here, and so that should work. Okay, so let's go ahead and save our file. And then we'll go ahead and turn on our server, or restart it if you haven't. And then I'm going to drag this over. And so we've got our queries tab. I already cheated here. But if you go ahead and run this query users, ID, first name, and what I think it was email. Users, yeah, email. So we can run that. We'll get our information. because the resolver is telling us, or is telling the code how to actually get the users, which is just returning the array. And once we're in here, like when we call this users function, what's actually happening is these three, each and every field that is being called has its very own resolver. GraphQL is smart enough to know how to get these, so we don't actually need to define them, but I want to show you what that looks like, because eventually when we get to relationships and more advanced queries, we will need them. So basically what's happening is the field level resolvers. So if I just go ahead and paste this here, so we've got the query, mutations and subscriptions, and then we also have types for each and every sort of like model that we have in the database. And so we're working with users, so each user has its own, so we've got ID, first name, and email, so we need a resolver for each one of these. And so when we're in this users function, it will call, so because we're calling over here, we've got ID, first name, and email. If we were to get rid of ID, then it doesn't need to call the ID resolver anymore. So it's not going to call this one. It's only going to call first name, the first name resolver, and the email resolver. I hope that makes sense. If we go ahead and just save this, we can see that this console log is going to run when we call it. So let's go ahead and restart the server. So restart, and then refresh. And if I run this function, then we can see that the field level resolver is called. But if we get rid of, what was that? Was that the email? That was the first name. So if we get rid of this first name and only get the email, then it's not going to, it's not going to call. So it didn't call this console.log what is parent thing anymore. So that's pretty much it for that. Okay, so let's try a query with an argument passed in. So if we want to get a specific user, then we would need to update our type defs again to create a query for an individual user. So let's go ahead and do that. Basically, we'll, just like before, go into your type defs, and you'll want to type in a individual user query. So user, and then you use the parentheses, and we can name this parameter whatever you want. I'm going to call it user ID, and we also have to tell it what type of primitive value it is. And ID is basically a string, so it's close enough. But so we'll go ahead and use that. So you would also do like string or int or whatever in there. And then the colon, and then the return type would be an individual user. So that's the definition. And then we need to actually create our resolver for that as well. Okay, so the first thing is the name of the function. We're going to call it user. And then we have the arguments, or the parameters that we have access to. So parent, args, context, and info, as always. And then the body of the function. And so we're going to use this JavaScript's find method. And so we'll use that to just sort or find in the array the object. So return users, the array that we have up hard-coded, find, and then we're just going to do this whole little thing here. If the user.id is equal to the args.userid that we passed into our query, then we will return that user. Okay, and so that's how we sort or find from our hard-coded array the user that matches the ID that we passed in. Go ahead and save the file and restart your server. So restarted, and then I don't even know if you have to, I don't think you have to refresh this, so I'm just gonna not do that. So let's go ahead and we're gonna change this query from users to user. And again, just like in our type definitions, it looks very similar. We have our user ID parameter, and we're going to pass in the argument of 456 because that is the ID of one of the users in our array. And then we can decide whichever fields we want. So email, first name, let's give that a try. and now we've got Todd. And so that is basically how individual user queries will work. How you query for an individual record using parameters. Okay, and one more thing I wanted to cover here is how to actually mock what an actual program would look like, because you can't actually access the GraphQL playground when you're writing code. You don't expect users to be able to type them in. So we need to retrieve code or arguments from our code, right? And so how we can do that is we can use named queries, and we'll get more into that later. But we're just going to call this this query get user. So get user, and then we have to define the name of the query variable. So we would call it user ID. You use the $sign in front of it. And then we could do a colon and then the type that it is supposed to be. So in our case, it's going to be an ID. Okay, and then down here, instead of typing in our ID manually, like 456, we would just use this $sign query variable, right? So user ID, and now we need to actually populate this user ID here. And so we would do that with our query variables tab down here. And so we would have an object, and then we type user ID, and then 1, 2, 3 or whatever. And I believe it needs to be quotes. So let's go ahead and try that. And now we've got Cindy. And so that's basically how we use query variables. And that's it for this video.
Thank you for watching our video. If you found it helpful, please click on the second link in the description to sign up for our newsletter, where we send our best content to help you improve your skills and stay up to date in the industry. Please subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button below and the bell to be notified when we release new tutorials. That's all for this video, everyone. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.